She owned a small diner and struggled for every dollar to feed her children. On a rainy evening, a hungry man who was being chased away everywhere else walked into the diner. Despite his problems, the woman offered him a warm dinner for free. He ate in silence and left a note on the table before leaving. She thought it was just a thank you, but when she read it, she froze in shock. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you're from. The rain drummed against the roof of the small diner, a steady rhythm that filled the otherwise silent space. Outside, the world was painted in muted grays, the streetlights casting long, trembling reflections on the wet pavement. A few cars that passed by sent ripples through the puddles, their headlights cutting through the misty darkness. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. But inside the tiny diner, there was no time to wait. Maria stood behind the counter, her fingers trembling slightly as she counted the cash in the register. The bills were worn, the coins cold against her skin, but no matter how many times she recounted, the total remained the same. It wasn't enough. Not for the rent, not for the electricity, not for the food she needed to buy for her children. She let out a slow breath and pressed her fingers against her forehead. Maybe she had missed something. Maybe there was an extra bill stuck somewhere between the others. She counted again, this time more carefully, but the numbers didn't change. Her gaze drifted toward the clock on the wall. Almost closing time. Business had been slow for weeks, and rainy nights like this one meant even fewer customers. She had debated closing early, saving the cost of keeping the lights on for a couple more hours, but part of her had held on to the hope that someone might come in. That one more meal served could bring in a little more money. That something, anything, could tip the balance just enough to give her another day to figure things out. She thought of Tommy and Sophia, her 12-year-old son and 9-year-old daughter, asleep at home. They needed new shoes, school supplies, warm jackets for the colder months ahead. She had already stretched every dollar as far as it could go, but there was nothing left to stretch. She pressed her lips together, considering something she had been avoiding for days. Her wedding ring. It still sat on her finger, a thin band of gold, the last tangible connection to her late husband. She ran her thumb over it absent-mindedly, staring at the register without really seeing it. If she sold it, she could buy groceries, cover part of the rent. He would understand. He would want her to do whatever it took to keep their children fed, to keep the roof over their heads. But the thought of parting with it made something tighten in her chest. A sharp gust of wind rattled the windows, making the neon sign outside flicker. She turned towards the door, hesitating. Perhaps she should lock up now. The streets were empty, and no one would be looking for a meal at this hour. But just as she reached for the switch, the bell above the door jingled. The door creaked open, and for a moment, all she saw was the rain-soaked figure standing in the entrance, framed by the glow of the streetlights. The man didn't step inside immediately. He stood there, motionless, water dripping from his clothes onto the floor. His coat was old, frayed at the edges, the fabric darkened by the rain. His shoes were worn, nearly coming apart at the seams. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his hat, his knuckles pale against his dark skin. Maria hesitated. Something about him made her pause. His posture was rigid, as if he were waiting for her to tell him to leave before he even stepped inside. His eyes, though, told another story. There was hunger there, deep and hollow, but also something else, something raw, something tired. She had seen that look before. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward, forcing a small smile onto her face. "Come in," she said gently. For a moment, he didn't move. His fingers tightened around his hat, and she could see the hesitation in his shoulders, the way his body tensed as if bracing for rejection. No one had welcomed him in a long time. Maria took another step closer, reaching for a clean towel from the counter. "You're dripping all over the floor," she said lightly. "Dry yourself off before you catch a cold." He finally stepped inside, though his movements were slow, cautious. The door closed behind him, shutting out the storm, but he still looked as if he didn't quite believe he was allowed to be there. "Sit wherever you like," Maria added, motioning toward the empty booths. "I'll get you something warm." He hesitated again, then nodded silently and moved toward the farthest table in the corner. He lowered himself onto the bench, his shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to take up as little space as possible. Maria glanced at him as she returned to the kitchen. Something about him reminded her of her father. Maybe it was the way he sat, the quiet resignation in his posture. Maybe it was the way he had hesitated before accepting kindness, as if he had learned not to expect it. She remembered her own childhood, the nights they had gone to bed hungry, the sacrifices her parents had made to make sure she and her siblings had enough. She turned on the stove and reached for the pot of broth she'd been planning to save for the next day. She wouldn't let anyone go hungry if she could help it. The scent of simmering chicken and herbs filled the air as she diced fresh vegetables, the rhythmic chop of the knife the only sound in the quiet diner. She baked a fresh loaf of bread to go with the meal, letting the aroma spread through the room. The warmth from the oven softened the chill that had seeped into her bones, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to forget about the bills, the debts, the uncertainty of tomorrow. When the meal was ready, she carefully ladled the steaming soup into a bowl and placed it on a tray along with thick slices of bread. She added an extra portion, along with a small bag of cookies she had baked earlier in the day. She carried the tray to the table where the man sat. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wide with something she couldn't quite name. She placed the food in front of him without a word, then stepped back. For a long moment, he simply stared at the meal. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the spoon, his fingers curling around the handle as if he weren't sure it was real. Then, finally, he took a bite. His eyes closed and his shoulders relaxed just a little. A deep breath shuddered through him, and when he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them. Something softer. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. Maria watched him from behind the counter, giving him space, but keeping an eye on him in case he needed anything. She pretended not to notice when he wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. She had seen that before, too. When he finished, he sat back with a quiet sigh, as if the warmth of the food had finally reached past his ribs and settled into his bones. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small notepad. His hands were steadier now as he scribbled something onto a piece of paper. Maria moved to clear his empty bowl, but as she reached for the tray, he gently placed the folded note on the table. "Keep the bread," she said softly, "for tomorrow." He looked at her, and for the first time he smiled. "Thank you," he murmured. His voice was quiet but steady. "No one has shown me kindness like this in a long time." Then he stood, tucking the bag of bread under his arm, and walked toward the door. The rain had slowed. Maria watched as he disappeared into the night, then turned back to the table. She reached for the note, expecting a simple thank you, but when she unfolded it, her hands began to tremble. She read the words once, then again, and then her heart began to race. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she held the note. The ink was neat, the words written with careful precision. Her eyes scanned the message over and over, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something different, something less impossible. The name at the bottom sent a jolt through her. Christopher Brown, a name she had seen before but couldn't immediately place. And then the last sentence. I have been watching your diner for weeks. I see potential. Tomorrow I will return with people who can help. Her breath caught in her throat. The words felt too surreal, too weighty. Was this some kind of joke? A cruel trick? But then she thought of the man's face, the way his eyes had softened as he ate, the quiet gratitude in his voice when he had thanked her. That hadn't been a lie. That had been real. She turned the note over, checking for anything else, some clue that might explain what was happening. But there was nothing more, just those few simple sentences that carried a promise too large to grasp. She sat back slowly, her fingers tightening around the paper. The storm outside had quieted to a soft drizzle, and the diner seemed unnaturally still. Maria forced herself to take a deep breath. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, there was nothing to do but wait. She had no way of knowing whether the man would truly return, whether his words carried any weight at all. But something deep inside her whispered that this was not a dream. It was something more. She glanced at the clock. It was later than she had realized. She needed to get home, to tuck her children into bed, to pretend for just a few more hours that everything was normal. Folding the note carefully, she slipped it into her apron pocket and stood. The rain had nearly stopped by the time she locked the door behind her. That night, she barely slept. Her mind kept returning to the man, to his quiet presence, to the way he had hesitated before stepping inside. She thought of the hunger in his eyes, the way he had savored each bite as if tasting something long lost. She thought of his story, how life had stripped him of everything he had built, how the world had turned him away again and again. And yet, something about him had remained unbroken. Something had brought him to her diner that night. Something had made him leave that note. She lay awake long after the city had gone silent, staring at the ceiling as the words echoed in her mind. Tomorrow, I will return. The next morning, she was at the diner before dawn. The air was crisp, the streets still damp from the night's rain. The sky was a deep shade of violet, the first hints of sunrise creeping over the rooftops. Maria unlocked the door with steady hands, though her heart was anything but calm. She set to work immediately. The morning routine was familiar, comforting. She ground fresh coffee beans, their rich aroma filling the small space. She kneaded dough for bread, her fingers pressing into the soft warmth, shaping each loaf with care. She chopped vegetables with practiced ease, letting the rhythmic motion soothe her nerves. She didn't know what she was preparing for exactly. She only knew that if he came back, she wanted to be ready. Hours passed and customers began trickling in. The usual crowd, Mrs. Thompson from the bookstore down the street, the young mechanic from the auto shop, the elderly couple who had been coming in for years. They chatted, ate, left. The morning rush came and went, and still Maria's eyes flicked to the door every time the bell rang. By lunchtime, she was starting to feel foolish. Maybe she had imagined it all, built up some wild fantasy around a simple thank you note. Maybe the man had written it in the moment, caught up in gratitude, and by morning he had changed his mind. But just as she was about to give up, the door opened. He was different this time. The tattered coat was gone, replaced by a clean, well-fitted suit. His shoes were polished, his posture straighter. He looked like a man who belonged in expensive restaurants, in high-rise offices with sweeping city views. And yet, his eyes were the same. Christopher Brown stepped inside, and behind him, several other men followed. They were sharply dressed, their presence commanding. Maria could tell immediately that these were not ordinary customers. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who made decisions, people who controlled the flow of money and opportunity. Maria wiped her hands on her apron, willing herself to stay calm as they approached the counter. "Good afternoon, Maria," Christopher said, his voice smoother than the night before, as if he had stepped back into the man he used to be. "I'd like to introduce you to some friends of mine." The men nodded in greeting. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and sharp eyes, reached for a menu. "I've heard good things about this place," he said. "I'd love to see what you can do." Maria's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a notepad. "What can I get for you?" They placed their orders, several dishes, a wide variety, as if testing the full range of her skills. Maria swallowed hard, then turned toward the kitchen. She had never felt pressure like this before. Not when she had first opened the diner, not even when she had been struggling to keep it alive. These men were not just customers. They were here for a reason. She moved quickly, her hands steadying as she fell into the rhythm of cooking. The sizzle of onions hitting the pan, the rich scent of garlic and spices, the comforting warmth of fresh bread rising in the oven. It was second nature to her. She plated each dish carefully, making sure every detail was perfect. Then, one by one, she carried them out to the waiting men. For several long minutes there was only silence. They tasted. They nodded to each other. They took notes. Maria stood behind the counter, her heart hammering. Finally, Christopher set down his fork and looked up. "This is exactly what I hoped for," he said. The others murmured their agreement. Maria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The silver-haired man leaned back in his chair, studying her. "We're interested," he said simply. Maria blinked. "Interested in what?" Christopher smiled. "In your diner. In you. We want to invest." The words sent a jolt through her, disbelief washing over her like a wave. "Invest?" she echoed. He nodded. "We believe in places like this, in people like you. Your food is exceptional, but more than that, your heart is in it. That's rare. We don't want to change what makes this place special. We just want to help you grow." Maria's throat tightened. How much growth are we talking about?" The silver-haired man folded his hands on the table. 5 locations to start, all built around the same warmth and quality you've already created here. Maria's knees felt weak. 5 locations, expansion, security, a future for her children. She pressed a hand to the counter to steady herself. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Christopher said softly. Maria looked at him, at the man who had walked into her diner as a stranger in the rain. Then she looked around, at the small space she had built with her own hands, at the memories woven into every corner. She thought of her children, of the nights spent worrying about their future. And then, finally, she smiled. "Yes," she said. Maria felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted. The words still hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible to ignore. 5 locations, expansion, investment. These were things she had never dared to dream of. Things she had pushed to the back of her mind as she fought just to keep her little diner alive. She stared at Christopher, at the quiet certainty in his expression, at the men around him who nodded in agreement. They weren't joking. They weren't offering empty words. They were serious. The weight of it pressed down on her, and for a moment, she struggled to find her voice. I don't understand, she finally said, her fingers gripping the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Why me? Why my diner? Christopher exchanged a glance with the silver-haired man, then looked back at her. Because I've seen how you treat people, how you put your heart into every meal you make. That's not something you can fake. It's not something money can buy. Maria swallowed hard. But there are so many restaurants in this city, bigger ones, more successful ones. And yet, Christopher said, none of them have what you have. His words were calm, measured, but there was something behind them, something deeply personal. Maria thought back to the way he had looked when he first entered her diner, how hesitant he had been, how much he had changed in just 24 hours. It wasn't just about the food. She glanced around her small space, at the worn but clean tables, the red and white checkered curtains, the family photos on the walls. This place had been her dream, her refuge. Could she really let it grow beyond what she had built with her own hands? Doubt crept in, but so did something else. Hope. The thought of security for her children, of finally paying off her debts, of waking up without the constant weight of worry pressing down on her chest. Could she turn her back on that? The silver-haired man leaned forward slightly. Maria, we don't want to take over. We want to help. We believe in places like this, and people like you. That's why we're here. Maria exhaled slowly. She looked at Christopher again. He was watching her closely, as if he could see the battle raging inside her. You don't have to decide right now, he said gently, but I do want you to know that this isn't a charity offer. It's an investment. We're not just giving you money, we're building something together. Maria hesitated. The logical part of her screamed at her to be cautious. Deals like this didn't just fall into people's laps, but there was something in the way he spoke. Something in the way he had carried himself from the moment he stepped through her doors. He wasn't here to trick her. He was here because he believed in her. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she said quietly. Tell me what this would look like. Christopher's lips twitched into a small smile. Let's sit down. The group moved to a larger table, and Maria found herself surrounded by people who spoke in a language she had only ever heard from businessmen on television. Investments, projections, franchise models. It was overwhelming, but Christopher made sure to explain things in a way she could understand. They would start by expanding her current diner into the vacant space next door. More tables, more kitchen space, more staff. Once that was successful, they would begin scouting locations for additional diners across the city, each one built around the same warmth and quality she had already established. She would still be in charge, still cook the same meals, still make sure that every customer felt at home. But she wouldn't have to do it alone anymore. Maria's mind spun as she tried to take it all in. It was more than she had ever imagined. When the meeting ended, the investors stood, shaking her hand one by one. We'll draft up the official contracts and have everything prepared within the next few days, one of them said. But for now, just think it over. We'll be in touch. Maria nodded, still feeling as though she were in a dream. As the men left, Christopher lingered behind. You took a chance on me, he said softly. Now I'm taking a chance on you. Maria met his gaze, and for the first time she truly understood. This wasn't just business for him. It was personal. "Thank you," she said, the words barely above a whisper. Christopher gave her a small nod, then turned and walked out into the city, disappearing into the bustling afternoon. Maria stood there for a long time after he was gone, her mind racing. This was happening. She had been given an opportunity that people spent their whole lives chasing. And yet, as she looked around her small diner, she felt a pang of something she hadn't expected. Change was coming, and whether she was ready or not, there was no turning back now. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Maria worked harder than ever, preparing for the first phase of the expansion. Contractors came to assess the space next door, measuring walls, discussing renovations. She interviewed new staff members, people she could trust to uphold the same values she had built her diner on. Her children noticed the change immediately. "Mom, why are you smiling so much?" Tommy asked one evening as they sat at the kitchen table. Maria hesitated, then ruffled his hair. "Because things are finally getting better." Sophia, ever the observant one, narrowed her eyes. "Does this mean we won't have to move?" Maria's throat tightened. They had been on the verge of losing everything, and her children had known it, even if she had tried to shield them from the worst of it. "No," she said softly. "We're staying right here." The relief in their faces nearly brought tears to her eyes. She wasn't just saving the diner. She was saving their home. One evening, after another long day of meetings and planning, Maria sat alone in her diner, the lights dimmed, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. The place felt different now, not just hers, but something bigger, something growing. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the folded note Christopher had left that first night. She unfolded it, reading the words again, feeling the weight of them in a new way. This note had changed everything. It had been the catalyst, the spark that had set this all in motion. And now, as she sat in the place she had fought so hard for, she realized something else. This wasn't just about saving her diner. It was about what the diner represented. A place where people weren't turned away. A place where kindness still mattered. A place where a man like Christopher Brown could walk in, soaked from the rain, and find warmth again. Maria smiled to herself, folded the note carefully, and placed it back in her pocket. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. And she was ready. Maria had always thought of her diner as a small, personal space, a place where she could pour her heart into every dish and know each customer by name. But now, as she stood in the doorway of what would soon become an expanded version of her dream, she felt an unfamiliar mix of excitement and apprehension. The contractors had already begun their work, tearing down the wall that separated her diner from the vacant unit next door. Dust floated in the air, mingling with the comforting scent of coffee and freshly baked bread. The sound of hammers and drills filled the space, a constant reminder that change was happening, fast. She had met with Christopher and the investors twice more since their initial conversation. Contracts had been drafted, reviewed, and signed. It still didn't feel entirely real. She had spent years struggling just to keep her head above water, and now she was sitting at the same table as men who spoke of growth and expansion as if it were the simplest thing in the world. But it wasn't simple for Maria. The transition wasn't easy. More staff meant training new people, trusting them with the recipes and the warmth that made her diner unique. More space meant more tables, which meant more customers, which meant she would have to adjust to a level of demand she had never faced before. Every morning, she woke before dawn and arrived at the diner before the construction crews. She brewed coffee, baked bread, and prepared meals, just as she always had. But now, she also spent hours reviewing business plans and sitting through meetings about inventory, marketing, and profit margins. It was exhausting, but for the first time in years, it was the kind of exhaustion that felt like it was leading somewhere. One morning, as she stood behind the counter kneading dough, the bell above the door jingled. Christopher stepped inside, dressed sharply in a navy blue suit, but there was an ease in his posture that hadn't been there when she had first met him. He had regained a confidence that seemed as natural to him as breathing. Maria wiped her hands on her apron. "Good morning," she said, offering him a small smile. "Good morning," Christopher replied, taking a seat at the counter. He glanced around at the construction work, nodding approvingly. "It's coming together faster than I expected." Maria sighed. "Faster than I expected, too. I barely have time to process it all before the next decision needs to be made." Christopher chuckled. "Welcome to business." She rolled her eyes but couldn't help but smile. "What can I get you?" "The usual," he said. Maria turned back to the kitchen, preparing a bowl of soup and a fresh roll of bread. It had become something of a ritual now. Christopher stopped by at least once a week, and every time he ordered the same thing, the meal that had started it all. As she placed the bowl in front of him, and he studied her for a moment, "You look tired," he said. Maria sighed, resting her hands on the counter. "I am, but it's a good kind of tired, I think." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. As he ate, the bell jingled again. This time, several men in suits entered, their expressions all business. Maria recognized some of them from their previous meetings, the investors who had placed their faith in her. They greeted Christopher with nods before taking seats at a table near the back. Maria felt a familiar nervousness settle in her stomach. Even though she had already signed the contracts, even though the expansion was well underway, she still felt like an outsider in these conversations. Christopher must have noticed because he gestured toward the table. "Come on," he said. "You should hear what they have to say." Maria hesitated, then untied her apron and stepped out from behind the counter. She smoothed her hands over her skirt, suddenly hyper-aware of the fact that she wasn't dressed like them, didn't speak like them, didn't belong in their world. But she followed Christopher anyway. The conversation at the table was already in full swing. The investors spoke about potential locations for the next diners, about market research and projections. Maria listened carefully, trying to absorb as much as she could. Then one of them turned to her. "We'd like to hear your thoughts, Maria," he said. "Where do you see this business in 5 years?" She blinked. No one had ever asked her that before. For years, she had only ever thought in terms of survival. Making it to the next month, the next week, the next day. She had never allowed herself to imagine what 5 years from now could look like. She glanced at Christopher, who gave her an encouraging nod. Maria took a breath. "I don't want this to just be a business," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I want it to be a place that means something to people. A place where they feel welcome, no matter who they are. I don't just want to serve food. I want to serve comfort, community." The investors exchanged glances. Then the silver-haired man, the one who had been the most reserved during their last meeting, leaned forward slightly. "That's exactly what we were hoping you'd say," he said. Maria felt something loosen in her chest. They weren't just investing in a business. They were investing in her vision. By the time the meeting ended, the expansion plans had been finalized. The first new location would open within 6 months. The rest would follow within the year. Maria returned to the kitchen, slipping her apron back on as the reality of it all settled over her. She was no longer just a woman trying to keep her small diner alive. She was a business owner, a leader, and soon she would be the heart behind something much bigger than she had ever dreamed. As the months passed, the changes became more and more real. The expanded diner reopened with a grand reintroduction to the community. Maria had worried that the regular customers would feel alienated by the changes, but to her relief, they embraced it. "The food still tastes the same," Mrs. Thompson told her one morning, sipping her coffee with a satisfied smile. "That's what matters." That was all Maria had wanted. The first new location opened on the other side of town, and then another and another. Each one carried the same warmth, the same recipes, the same sense of belonging that she had worked so hard to cultivate. And through it all, Christopher was there. They became partners in more than just business. He helped her navigate contracts and financial decisions, while she taught him how to knead dough and season broth. He no longer wore the tattered coat he had entered her diner in that first night, but Maria never forgot the man who had sat in the corner, too hungry and too proud to ask for help. Neither did he. One evening, after the last customer had left, Christopher lingered behind. He stood near the framed note she had hung in her office, the note he had left for her on that rainy night so many months ago. "You kept it," he said quietly. Maria nodded. "It's a reminder." "Of what?" She smiled, meeting his gaze. "That one small act of kindness can change everything." Christopher was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he smiled too. Neither of them had expected any of this, but sometimes the best things in life weren't planned. Sometimes they simply started with a warm meal on a cold night. Maria never imagined her life would turn out this way. Not long ago, she was just a woman trying to keep her small diner afloat, worrying about overdue bills and whether she could afford school supplies for her children. Now, she stood in the doorway of her third new location, watching as a team of workers put the finishing touches on the interior. The place had the same warm atmosphere as her original diner: red and white checkered curtains, wooden tables, the soft hum of an old radio playing in the background. The air smelled of fresh bread, just as it always had, and the kitchen was stocked with the same ingredients she had used since the very beginning. She had insisted on it. Even with the success, with the investors, and the expansion, she had refused to let her diners turn into something cold, something corporate. She trained every new cook personally, taught them how to make her grandmother's chicken soup just right, how to knead the dough for bread until it had the perfect softness. But more importantly, she taught them what really mattered. Food made with love always tastes better, she told each new employee, and no one leaves hungry, even if they can't pay. She knew what it was like to be in that position, to have nowhere else to turn, to feel invisible, to be ignored or turned away. No one would experience that in her diners. She walked through the space, running her fingers lightly along the polished countertops. Everything was ready. They would open their doors in 2 days, welcoming another neighborhood into the warmth of what had started as a tiny diner on a forgotten street corner. Christopher arrived just as she was checking the final details of the menu. He was different now from the man who had first walked into her life on that rainy night. He carried himself with confidence again, not the weary resignation of a man who had lost everything. But he had not forgotten. Maria saw it in the way he treated people, in the way he always stopped to shake hands with the staff, in the way he never let a homeless person pass by without offering them a warm meal. He had found his place again. As he stepped inside, he smiled at her. "It looks perfect." Maria exhaled, still feeling the nervous energy that always came before a grand opening. "I hope so." Christopher walked past her, taking in every detail as he had at every other location. "The city needs more places like this," he said, "places that feel like home." Maria looked around, letting his words sink in. This was what she had built, not just a business, but a space where people could feel seen, welcomed, valued. It was the kind of place where a man could walk in from the cold, drenched from the rain, and leave with more than just a full stomach. The first few months of expansion had been exhausting. There were endless challenges, finding the right people, making sure the food stayed true to its roots, ensuring that every new location kept the warmth of the original diner. But she had done it. And now, as she looked out the window and saw families passing by, stopping to glance inside with curiosity, she felt something deep in her chest. She had made it. That evening, she returned to the original diner, where it had all started. The place was still full of familiar faces, customers who had been coming for years, neighbors who treated it like an extension of their own homes. Sitting in her usual seat was Mrs. Thompson, the bookstore owner, sipping her coffee as she did every night. At another table, a young mechanic leaned over a plate of steaming food, laughing with a friend. Near the counter, an elderly man and his wife split a slice of pie, the same way they always had. Nothing had changed here, and that was exactly how Maria wanted it. She stepped behind the counter, tying her apron around her waist. She still cooked here from time to time, still greeted customers by name, still felt the heartbeat of the place in every conversation, every shared meal. She wouldn't let success take that away. Later that night, after the last customers had left, Maria sat alone at a corner table, sipping tea. The framed note Christopher had once left her still hung on the wall in her office, a reminder of how all of this had begun. Christopher joined her, setting down his own cup of coffee. "You're thinking about it again, aren't you?" he said, nodding toward the note. Maria smiled. "It still feels like a dream sometimes." He leaned back in his chair. "Well, it's real, and it's only the beginning." She knew he was right. There were more diners to open, more neighborhoods to reach, more people to help. But no matter how much they grew, no matter how successful they became, she would never forget the truth of it all. It had started with a single act of kindness, a warm meal on a cold night, and a promise that had changed everything. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another one. Want more? Check out our other videos for more incredible stories that will keep you inspired. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family, because sometimes a single story can make all the difference.